Good afternoon. I apologize for all of yesterday's confusion and technical issues I encountered, and ask you to come again on Tuesday evening, but there really wasn't much I could do about it. This afternoon and early this evening, we're going to cover chapters 10, 11, and 12. Chapter 10, Motivating Employees. Chapter 11, Human Resource Management, Finding and Keeping the Best Employees. And then we'll move to Chapter 12, which is labor, dealing with unions and labor management issues. So let's look at the objectives for Chapter 10. Explain Taylor's theory of scientific management. Describe the Hawthorne studies and their significance to management. Identify the levels of Maslow's hierarchy of needs and apply them to employee motivation. Distinguish between the motivators and hygiene factors identified by Hertzberg. Differentiate among theory X, theory Y, and theory Z. Then explain the key principles of goal setting, expectancy, reinforcement, and equity theories. Show how managers put motivation theories into action through such strategies as job enrichment, open communication, and job recognition. And finally, show how managers personalize motivation strategies to appeal to employees across the globe and across generations. So let's move forward here. We find that there are two kinds of rewards that leaders, managers can give to their employees. One is known as an intrinsic reward, and the other is known as an extrinsic reward. An intrinsic reward is something that comes from within. It is pride in your accomplishments, pride in your performance, having a sense of getting things done, and knowing you were responsible and not asking somebody to come over and pat you on the back. Now, that doesn't mean to say a pat on the back is not good, not appreciated, but sometimes we don't always need that. An extrinsic reward, on the other hand, is something that is given to an employee by someone else in recognition for his or her outstanding achievements. And notice here what's listed: pay raises, promotions, things of that nature. Recognizes the employee of the month or employee of the week, things like that. So we come to theories of motivation, and the first one we come to is what is known as scientific management. Scientific management is really indelibly intertwined with the theories and research done by Frederick W. Taylor, known as the father of scientific management. And he's actually the first person to put some things into practice to help managers motivate is necessarily a good word, but help to managers to control in a way the work of their employees and how their employees approach work. And Taylor said that there were things that you had to do. You had to study how people worked, give them the best tools and things of that nature, and then have rules and procedures showing them how to do this work. And there were other elements of time, methods of work, and rules of work that Taylor advocated. And these are Taylor's principles. Taylor said that to know what is to be done, you have to study the job. So you have to know the tasks and get along with them and things of that nature. And if you didn't, you couldn't really tell a person how to do his or her job or train a person to do his or her job. What Taylor said you had to do was gather information. And he talked about time and motion, because in those days, a lot of work was done based on time and motion. and then see how jobs can be performed. Are there different ways to do the same thing, and which way is best? And you won't know that unless you do some study. Now, once you've figured out the best method, set some rules in place. Let's look at these as not use the word rule, but use the word standard, because we all have standards at work. What is it that makes this piece of work better than something else? Because here's the standard we want it to be performed to. Make sure that you get the right worker who has the right skills and match that person with the job. So this is what's known today as a job, as a person's skill fit. This person has the requisite skills to fit the job that is open. And then finally, establish a good level of pay. So here Taylor went on to talk about his time and motion studies. And what he was saying here was, let's find out how long it takes a person to perform a task, and then we'll have a standard. And then notice that this led to what's known as the motion of economy. That means that you want to be able to do something with the least amount of tasks or least amount of effort to be able to perform. Now, when I say least amount of effort, that does not mean effort is not good. It just says you don't want to do more than what's required in effort and motion and time to do the job. So that's what Taylor was actually really saying. That was the essence of it. Find out how long it takes to do this job, understand all the things that are required to do the job, and then make sure that you give this person the right tools to do the job. If you don't, a person is not going to be successful. And we can't hold that person to the standards because we've not established the standards. Now, what you see here is, and what you see displayed in the text, and you see this gentleman here, UPS employee, and you can see him on page 271 in your text. UPS still follows or uses Taylor's principles of scientific management. And look at what they tell their drivers, their delivery people. How you get out of the truck, how fast to walk, what finger you carry the key ring on, etc., and how the keys are carried. A lot of people would bristle because they see these as being onerous. But I'm here to tell you that UPS has great success in hiring employees who fit their model, fit their work model, and what's known as a loyal soldier. We don't talk about that concept in this text, and I'm not going to explain it. If you want to explain, let me know, and I'll give it to. I'll explain it to you. And their employees stay with the company for a long period of time. Now, Taylor's work was followed some years later. Taylor, by the way, first wrote his book, and I don't remember the exact name of it, The Principles of Scientific Management, excuse me. I did know it, and I forgot about it, in 1911. Taylor's work was followed, not subsequently, not because of what Taylor did, by a group of Harvard researchers led by Elton Mayo. And they conducted a number of experiments at the Hawthorne plant, the Western Electric plant in Hawthorne, Illinois. So you'll see this Mayo or Hawthorne studies listed. Actually was conducted at the Western Electric plant. Western Electric was the research arm of AT&T. And so what they wanted to do here was they wanted to see how workers performed under various conditions, and one being the levels of light. Now, there were other experiments besides the one we're going to talk about here. What they found was that as they were working with these these employees, these Western Electric employees, in a specific setting that kept producing the light until the light really became no more than what you would see if you walked outside and you had only moonlight. Now remember that these studies were conducted in the late 1920s and early 1930s, and we didn't have all the extra light from buildings and other type things that we do today. What they found was that the production increased regardless of the level of light. And so, pardon me, I'm fighting a little bit of a cold here. What they found was that it wasn't the setting, the working conditions, if you will, that it had to be an interaction, a byplay between and among the employees. And so that there was some psychological factor going on here, a human relations factor, etc. So then what they concluded once they found that out, by the way, there were evidence, I'm going to give you one that the text does not discuss here, is that this was known as the Hawthorne effect, and that people act differently when they know they're being observed. There was another one that I found more interesting, I think, than the ones that are mentioned here. And that is workers, and these were all women. By the way, all the experiments were not all women. Some were men, some were women. There was no men and women mixed together. They decided to have an experiment where they would reduce the work week from 6 days to 5. Now, in the 1920s and 1930s, the normal work week was 6 days. And so what the researchers did was they eliminated the 6th day, and they immediately determined, well, production is going to go down 16% because we took one day out. 6 into 100 is 16 and 2/3, so I'm running at the 16%. And what they found was just what they found here. Actually, production went up. And a lot of it went up because the employees were allowed to consult amongst themselves, set their own work schedules, set their own production levels, et cetera, et cetera. Again, we came back to this thing that, of course, they were being observed. And so they acted differently when they knew they were being observed. So there were a number of things. There was also one with a relay bank room and a few other things. But all of this revolved around the fact that people acted differently when they knew they were being observed. And think about that yourselves. Don't you act differently when you know someone is watching you? Even if it's not at work, somebody's watching you. You think, well, gee, what's this person doing watching me? I'm probably not going to act the way he or she thinks I should act. So I encourage you to use a Google or another search engine and type in either Elton Mayo, E-L-T-O-N-M-A-Y-O, or Hawthorne effect, and you'll get additional information from what's in the text. We then move to Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And what Maslow is saying here is that people have different levels of needs. And at the most basic level, it's the person's need for basic survival needs, as mentioned in the text. That's food and water and things of that nature. And then it goes up the ladder here in Maslow's hierarchy, and it goes to from physiological needs. We'll show you this pyramid here in a second. Physiological needs to safety needs, to social needs, and then to esteem needs, and finally to self-actualization. What Maslow is saying here, or what he did say, is that you cannot move to a higher level need until a lower level need is satisfied. And so he's saying that you can't move up this ladder, if you will, up this pyramid, which we're going to show. And by the way, you can see this in your text on page 274, figure 10.1. And you notice here that psychological needs and safety needs are at the lowest level, and you move to social esteem and self-actualization. Now, some of Maslow's original work said that nobody actually ever reaches self-actualization because there's always something else that they have to move forward to. Researchers contend that Maslow's theory is not completely reliable and cannot be replicated because they believe that the researchers believe that more than one need can be satisfied at a time. Remember, Maslow says this is like a hierarchy. That's actually what he calls it. And so it's level 1, level 2, level 3. So after we have that, we have Hertzberg's dual factor theory on motivating factors. And Hertzberg and his colleagues centered on two questions which are mentioned here on the slide. And I want to read these to you because they're very important for us to think about when we get here. What factors controlled by managers are most effective in increasing worker motivation? Notice that, controlled by someone else. And then how do workers rank job-related factors in order of importance related to motivation? Now, Hertzberg said that this boils down to two things. They come in what's known as the job content, and the other comes in what is known as the job context. That is, context of the job itself. Content, on the other hand, refers to physical setting, etc. Well, the text here just disagreed with what I said, or I just disagreed with what the text said. As I recall, it is context as opposed to content. Let's stay away from that. Don't worry about context or content. Let's look at motivating factors and hygiene factors. As is mentioned here in the text, figure 10.2 at the bottom of the page, which we will get to next. Motivators are something, obviously, that cause satisfaction. If they didn't cause satisfaction, they wouldn't be called motivators. There'd be no reason to call them a motivator. So that's what we're looking at for motivators. Hygiene factors, on the other hand, as job environment talks about, that means the setting, the conditions, et cetera, don't motivate employees. So what that means is if you have a nice office with pastel colors and things of that nature, it is not going to motivate you to do your job better. These things, notice here, the hygiene factors can cause dissatisfaction if those niceties, if you will, within the job environment are missing. So if you work in a place that has a rusty roof and a leaking ceiling and things like that, that's going to cause you job dissatisfaction. But repairing them and bringing them back to standard will not improve job satisfaction and won't improve motivation. So here are the motivators, which we can see here on, this is figure 10.2 at the bottom of page 275. Motivators, the work of self, achievement, recognition, etc. And hygiene factors are things like pardon me, rules and policies, working conditions, salary, etc. Now, many people will disagree with that because a lot of my students in the past have said that they believe salary is a motivator. And, you know, I'm not going to disagree with that. But I would tell you that if you're in a job that you truly like, and you like it, and you get satisfaction out of completing the job, etc. As long as you receive a fair wage. Now, notice I use the term fair wage. You're going to be satisfied. And so actually receiving an increase in salary may not be a motivator. Now, it could be. If that increase in salary comes along with a promotion, yeah, I think that's probably right. What this particular slide here shows, and you can see this in figure 10.3 on page 276, is how the Hertzberg factors stack up with the Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Now, there's one thing that I want to say to you about Hertzberg, and I want you to keep this in mind, and this is not meant to denigrate his work. Hertzberg surveyed, his research was conducted with 200 different individuals. Each individual that was surveyed was either an accountant or an engineer. That is not a random sample of the population. And because of that, Hertzberg's work has never been replicated by other researchers. Now, usually for research to have, or theories to have good standing, other researchers have to be able to replicate the study and then reach the same conclusions and outcomes that the original work did, or the original researchers did, to say, yeah, this theory holds water. However, having said that, there is much to be said for Hertzberg's theory, dual factor theory, motivators, and hygiene factors in the workforce today. And you will see that mentioned in the text. We move now to Douglas McGregor's theory X and theory Y. McGregor said that managers, and this is probably still true today, actually have different assumptions about workers. And it kind of comes down to how well they either get along with workers, treat workers, manage workers, etc., or they don't. Theory X simply says that people don't like to work. And that the only way to get people to work is to threaten them, and that they don't want to take responsibility. They want you to tell them what to do, and that their primary motivators are fear, punishment, and money. Now, money is not listed there, but I threw that in because it's part of it. Theory Y is just the reverse. It says that people like work, and work is a normal piece of life, just like leisure time and things of that nature. That workers want to be challenged, that they will work toward goals that they think they can achieve. They'll work toward goals that they think that they're tied to adequate rewards. We'll talk about that in equity theory a little bit later on. They use their creative juices to solve problems, and they're motivated by a variety of rewards. Now, William Uchi looked at the cultural differences between Japanese workers and American workers. He used the type A to be designated an American worker and type J for Japanese. He said that the type A focuses on individual. And that has been the mantra of people from in the United States for pretty much from its founding. We're individualists. We don't tend to be team players. Now, yes, I know there's team sports and other things, but we don't tend to be team players. That's embedded in our American culture. Pardon me. That doesn't mean to say that things aren't changing. We do see more emphasis on teams today, etc. So what he proposed is a theory Z, which is a hybrid, and it kind of brings together the best of the A and the J people. And I'm not going to discuss this a whole lot. It is presented in your text. You can see this in the figure 10.4 at the top of page 279. So notice what he says here, that we have an American on the left, Japanese on the right, and then his Z person is a modified American. I guess the only thing that I would disagree with at the beginning there is the long-term employment, because we find that today's worker is not committed to long-term employment like he or she used to be. That is not to be seen as a derogatory comment. It's just a changing society, and we find it. Pardon me, there are differences. Now, we find a comparison of theory X, theory Y, and theory Z at the bottom of page 279, figure 10.5, and I commend you to look at that. However, we're not going to dwell on it. We are going to move to what is known as goal-setting theory. And this is where the manager or the leader and his or her direct reports set goals to be achieved over a certain period of time. And notice that achievable goals can motivate an employee because he or she can see that there is a way to get from point A, beginning, to point Z, ending. If the goal is either too difficult, and the worker clearly sees that there's no way that he or she can get there regardless of having all the right resources, you can't expect them to be committed. And the same is true if the goal is too easy. If the worker sees this, he or she is going to say, why should I spend my time on something that's easy as snapping my fingers? I've got to have something different. So notice the things that you have to have here with goal-setting theory. There has to be feedback, and of course, the organization has to support this. One of the most popular types of goal-setting theories is what is known as management by objectives. And notice that this is here where the manager and the worker get together and they discuss what's going to be done, and they review it and they evaluate it, and then they go forward. So one of the things that is concerned about this is that because this is between the worker and his or her supervisor manager, that will take on greater importance than the organization's goals and objectives. And of course, finally, results have to be done, monitoring results have to be done, and then if achievement is found, then that has to be rewarded. Next, we move to what's known as the expectancy theory, and you can see this starting on page 280, and then the graphic at the top, the figure, which we'll get to in a second, which is 10.6. And the first thing the employee says to him or herself is, "Can I do this? And then if I can do it, how am I going to be rewarded? what's the value of the reward? Is it going to be worth my effort? And then we'll decide whether or not we're going to do it. So here's the slide here that we want you to look at. An employee says, can I do this, as we mentioned before? And if he or she says, I can't, motivation is not there. If the employee says, yes, I can, then he or she says, is the reward commensurate with what I have to do? And if it's no, again, no, not motivated. If the answer is yes, then it is motivated. Nadler and Waller, two researchers and management gurus, modified the expectancy and say that we managers, we supervisors should find out what type of reward the employee values. Look at the performance standard. Make sure performance standards are attainable. That goes back to goal setting theory. Can I achieve this? Tie the reward to the performance, and then make sure that the employee believes that the reward is adequate for the amount of effort expended. Reinforcement theory. Most of us know a little bit about reinforcement theory because it's been around for a long period of time. And what this simply says is that there are two kinds. There's positive and negative. If you use positive reinforcement, that means that whatever you're reinforcing, you want the employee to continue doing. If you use negative reinforcement, it means you want the employee to stop doing that because that's counterproductive or against company policy or something else. Positive reinforcement, notice what that includes here. And I'm not going to go through that, but just to mention, pay, promotion, recognition, etc. Negative comes to the things that stop doing it, just like you would reprimand a child. You might reduce recognition. You might even think about things such as layoff and firing. Now, I would say to you that layoff and firing comes under a different thing, and that comes under thought about employee counseling and employee discipline. Although we can look at discipline in a negative way as well. Extinction, notice that stop behavior by not responding to it. So that talks about the different types of reinforcement theory and how we use it. Equity theory is one of the last ones we want to use before we get to job enrichment. And that is where an employee actually has what is known as a comparative other. And equity, talks about fairness. And so what the employee here is trying to do is maintain equity between his or her inputs and outputs versus a comparison other. And as long as the employee believes that there is equity between what he or she is doing and being rewarded for and what his or her comparison other is doing and being rewarded for, the performance will continue. Excuse me a second. Once that employee perceives that it's not equitable, he or she will do a number of things or has a number of choices to make, none of which are good for the long-term betterment of the company. It can reduce inputs and outputs. They can revert to absenteeism. They can consider resigning or they could look for a different comparison other. That probably different comparison other won't happen. Other things will happen sooner. So we have to be careful about this, especially if employees feel or believe that their performance is not being rewarded as well as their comparison other. We now move to job enrichment, which is another type of motivation. Job enrichment is listed here in your text and has 5 tenets. And it talks about variety of the work being done, task identity, its significance, autonomy. That means how much freedom does the worker have to complete the tasks on his or her own and in his or her own way, as long as he or she is adhering to standards. And then the worker gets feedback on his or her performance. There are a number of ways to do this. One is known as job enlargement. Here, what that does is, in many cases, combining tasks that were previously done separately into one, notice what it says here, challenging and interesting assignment. Job rotation is a strategy where a person moves from job to job, learning new tasks and new skills, so he or she becomes a more valuable employee. Let's move here. Open communication as a method of motivation. Notice what it says here at the first. It creates a culture that rewards listening. And one of the biggest problems that all of us have is we don't listen well. We are so interested in formulating our response to what's being said that we stop listening, think about what we're going to say, and we miss part of the message. So this is what this is talking about. This is saying removing barriers to open communication and asking employees what's important to them. Some of the things we kind of discussed in the review of the videos for last week. What I say to you is this, with communication, be careful in using social media. Many companies have policies against social media or what you can do and say on social media. A lot of people say, wait a minute, that's an infringement on my freedom, my right to free speech. Well, you can make that argument. But if we're doing social media and you're perceived as either doing it on company time or you are being associated with the company in some negative way, you can expect some type of discipline. So all I say to you is be careful with using social media. I realize that the younger folks don't, and I'm certainly not in that category, don't like bans on social media because of some of the things I just said, infringement upon rights, etc. But you have to be careful about this. I don't necessarily agree with the comment here. It means that organizations don't trust their employees. I think what it says is organizations are concerned about their image, and they have every reason to be concerned about their image. And if an employee does something and that whatever that social media post is negatively impacts on the company, then you can expect some kind of retribution. So I'm not suggesting don't use social media. I'm just saying find out what your company policy is. If you're in a position to say, hey, wait a minute, we ought to re-examine this, we're being very restrictive here, then I certainly encourage you to do that. I just point out that there are dangers to using social media. A lot of people used to use them. They post things that are scurrilous and frivolous and things like that. And they think, well, if I'm doing that and nobody knows who I am, what difference does it make? Now, take responsibility for what you're going to do if you're going to use social media, email, whatever it happens to be. Notice here that the benefits that employees get, or perks, if you will. Pay is not the only thing to be considered. Flexible scheduling, paid time off, stock options, child care, etc. And those are all things that can and do, in some instances, motivate employees. This particular slide just said things that are good for you, open to what employees believe are good for them, open communication, recognition, etc. And what's not good for you, lack of open communication, failure to recognize achievements, micromanagement, etc. We're going to pass that one. We have to be cognizant of cultural differences. A high context culture, which is not Americans, require relationships and group trust before performance. Low context, which is American, believe relationship building distracts from tasks. So we have to know who we're talking about here. Does that mean we change standards? No, it doesn't mean we change standards. Does that mean we change work policies? No, it doesn't, but it means that there are different ways to motivate different types of employees within the workforce, and we need to know what those are and have strategies to reach them. This just goes on to saying a better understanding of culture is really imperative, especially in today's workforce and since we do so much globalization. This is how people from other generations, what their thought processes are, etc. And other different generations. This is what Generation X expects in the workforce. And I'm not going to go into that too much. And this is what millennials expect. And again, I'm not going to cover that a whole lot. What I do want to say to you, as I've said before, is to be cognizant of the differences. And this is how other people like to interact. Baby boomers prefer meetings and conference calls. Generation X, email. Generation Y and millennials like to use technology, particularly going through social media. We've reached 5:13. That brings me to the end of chapter 10. We'd like to, yes, chapter 10. We'll take a short break. Let's come back at 5:16 and we'll discuss chapter 11, Human Resource Management, Finding and Keeping the Best Employees. Please come back at 5:16. I can't beat that. All right, it's 5:16. We're back. Chapter 11, Human Resource Management, Finding and Keeping the Best Employees. Our learning objectives are to explain the importance of human resource management and look at some current issues. Look at the impact that legislation has on human resource management. Look at the 5 steps in human resource planning. We'll describe the methods that companies use to recruit new employees and explain some of the issues that make recruiting challenging. Excuse me. Outline the steps in selecting employees. Illustrate employee training and development methods. We'll not so much illustrate them as we'll talk about them. Look at the 6 steps in appraising employee performance. And finally, summarize the objectives of employee compensation programs. And we will look at, not so much evaluate, we will look at pay systems and fringe benefits. Human resource management. This is determining if a company's human needs, employee needs, and then doing the things that get them in the workforce: recruiting, selecting, developing, motivating. Human resource management probably doesn't do the motivation itself, but it talks about motivation. It trains managers in motivation techniques. Evaluating, again, they don't do it as much as managers do, but they have to train them to do that. Setting up compensation programs, and then scheduling employees to achieve organizational goals. It used to be years ago that human resource management was actually record keeping and having employees filling out forms and taking care of insurance claims and things of that nature. That's all changed today because someones have finally discovered that the most important resource an organization has is its employees. Yes, they're the most expensive, but they're also the most important. And we have to figure out ways to get the right people in the right place and then keep them there. And of course, the laws have changed to the betterment, and that impacts human resource management because they have to keep abreast of the laws and keep their managers and supervisors and leaders informed of laws changes and the impact on the workforce. On top of page 301, the figure 11.1, which we're looking at here on the slide, shows organization goals, and then the different things that we're going to talk about within this chapter and what we discussed in the last chapter and what we're going to talk about in chapter 12. This talks here about technical skills. People with technical skills are scarce and it's hard to find. They're hard to find. I don't disagree with that, but we're finding that many employees having different skill levels, not just so much in the high-tech industry, are becoming more and more difficult to find. And it is a concern to many organizations because we need to have a educated, dedicated, and trained workforce, not just in any particular industry. That's across the spectrum. And we have to do whatever it is we need to do to make sure that the people who have fallen behind because manufacturing is no longer available in the United States. A lot of manufacturing jobs, you have to understand, didn't require much education. Many of them do today. You have to know how to use the computer and do some other things. Computer-aided design and manufacturing, we talked about last week. And so we have to make sure those people get trained and get back into the workforce at a very productive level. This just talks about the issues that we face. shortage of trained workers. We know that we find more competition from global competitors because they can pay less wages. And we know that there's an increase on companies for benefits, et cetera. And the amount of benefits that a company gives to its employees has increased today exponentially. And I'm not saying that that's wrong or bad, but those are things that employers look at, and that's why you have this constant fight and a larger fight today of companies moving to areas where they can build plants and they don't have to worry about union workers. Why is that bad? We'll talk about unions a little bit more in Chapter 12. Why is that necessarily good? Well, what happens is that you now have workers doing the same job and making less money than somebody else does. Yes, unions have caused some problems on their own, but we have to be careful about how we do those things. We know that the workforce landscape changed after the passage of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, especially Title VII, which prohibited discrimination in all of its ugly forms. Unfortunately, it is still around today. And we need to work especially hard to eliminate that. People who come to work, who are considered for employment, should be judged on several things. The most important is, do they have the skills to do the job? Then we may have to look at education and a few other type things. But we can't worry about somebody's race or their ethnicity or something else. Those are all distractors. They have nothing to do with whether a person can perform the job. That's the critical point we need to look at. And we don't, pardon me, don't need to worry about whether they're men or women. Now, the Equal Employment Opportunity Act of 1972 strengthened Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, EEOC, gave the EEOC right to issue workplace guidelines for, notice what it says, acceptable employer conduct. Employers should treat their workers as humans, simply. EEOC can mandate specific record keeping, and it does have the power of enforcement. And one of the things I like to stop and say here is EEOC is populated by people who are not elected. But the elected officials, those members of Congress, gave them that authority. So before we ever criticize this type of agency, we ought to go back to Congress and say, hey, wait a minute, Mr. and Miss Congressman and Mr. and Miss Senator, did you mean to give these people this authority? And if you did, then maybe you ought to look at what's being done. On the other hand, we can't expect 535 elected members of Congress to be able to do all the policing that the EEOC does. Affirmative action, it's a bugaboo. A lot of people don't like it. All affirmative action does, always meant to do, was to level the playing field. It was not set up with priorities. It was not set up that you have to hire a certain percentage of minorities or women or something else. Now, if you had a federal contract, you did, but no private employer was required to hire a certain percentage of minorities or women. Now, in some cases that they were told their employment practices were not right. And I'll give you the classic example. There's a very well-known company, Allen Bradley. They're in Wisconsin, and they only recruited by word of mouth. And that meant that a current employee recommended a person to come in and find a job. What's wrong with that? Well, on the face of it, nothing. But when your workforce is 100% white and the referrals are 100% white, and you're in a community that is 30 or 40% minority or even higher, that means there's some kind of unintentional discriminatory practice. So Allen Bradley was asked to change their recruiting practices. Reverse discrimination is something we hear normally from whites, are saying, well, they're taking my job away and giving it to a minority. So we have to be careful about that. And I have to be careful that the rights of the majority, if they are still a majority, which that won't be many years from now, not too many years from now, are being trampled upon. So that's something we have to pay attention to. We don't want to give unfair advantage to somebody else. And by the way, affirmative action, I'm going to go back to this for a second, never told you had to hire somebody who was unqualified to do the job. Never said that. It's all perception. It's all wrong in what's being said. Now, affirmative action never helped me get a job, but I'm a firm believer in it. I want to tell you that, and that's not to curry favor with anybody. I just believe it. I believe if you're doing your job right, you want to cast a net wide enough that you're going to attract as many possible people, and that'll be women and minorities and everything else, and that you will hire the best out of that best. And of course, as you know, or as you should know, affirmative action has been under fire for many years, and the Supreme Court has taken a number of cases and has done some weakening of it. I suspect if the current trend continues, we'll see more weakening of affirmative action. The Civil Rights Act of 1991 expanded the 1964 Civil Rights Act, and plaintiffs can now, these are the victims of discrimination, have a right to a jury trial and could be awarded damages. And then the Office of Federal Contract Compliance ensures that employers doing business with the United States government comply with non-discrimination and affirmative action laws. By the way, I just want to mention to you one quick aside before we get away from affirmative action. Affirmative action is not a law. It was mandated by executive order by President Lyndon Johnson in 1965, I believe. Don't hold me to that, but I think I'm right at that year. And he did that based upon growing up, and he saw that many Mexican Americans and other Hispanics just did not have the same opportunity to find work that other people had. Notice I used the word opportunity, not to be given a job, the opportunity to try to get a job. We have the Americans with Disabilities Act in 1990. There's a lot of misconception about this. It requires employers with 25 or more employees to make reasonable, that is the actionable word, reasonable accommodations to an employee. And I'll give you an idea of a reasonable. A guy or gal comes to work, and he or she is confined to a wheelchair, but is otherwise qualified to do clerical work. However, the files that he or she has to use on a daily basis are up here. So a reasonable accommodation would be moving the files down. Now, if the accommodation is not reasonable and it would be too onerous on the employer to implement, they don't have to do it. A classic example of that is a person with a disability came in and wanted to get a job and had something to do with production. And the only way that he would be able to do the job was that the conveyor belt would have to be reversed. In other words, instead of running clockwise, it would have to run counterclockwise. And the company said, we can't do that. And he sued, went to court, and the court said, wait a minute, that's not a reasonable accommodation. So that's the deal. We also have Age Discrimination Act. This protects people over 40 from being discriminated against in promotions and firings and layoffs and things of that nature. Now, this is the salient thing here I want you to take away from this particular slide. Ignorance of the law is not a defense. No employer can say, had we known that, we wouldn't have allowed that. Well, that doesn't work. So that's why it is incumbent upon the HR department to know the law and make sure that the company is complying with the law. Now, this is the HR planning process. First of all, you're going to do an inventory. And then once you've done an inventory, you're going to prepare a job analysis. I would like to say job analyses because most likely you're talking about more than one job. Assess the demand for employees. Now, remember, when you're assessing demand for employees, you have to take into consideration what other organizations are going to need. Find out what's going to be in the labor supply somewhere down the road, what's here today and then what's going to be down the road, and then developing a plan to be able to get those needed human resources. What's a job analysis? It's a study. Analysis tells us we're going to study something of what the employee does at work. The job description, there are two things that make this up. One is a job description, or they actually go along with the job analysis. One's a job description, the other is job specification. The description details what's being done, responsibilities, reporting activities, things of that nature. Also talks about working conditions, etc. A job specification says what are the minimum, it says qualifications. I'm going to change the word to requirements for the job. And that includes education and skillability and a few other type things. One of the things the major thing that I want you to take away from this slide is minimum qualifications. There's a reason for that. If you don't have minimum qualifications and you raise them higher, for instance, you've done a job analysis and you've seen the current person on the job and he or she holds a master's degree, for instance, in engineering. And so you write that into the analysis and it goes to the job specification. And the next guy or gal comes in and gets hired, has the master's degree and finds out that, wait a minute, I don't need all this extra education. This job is actually beneath me. And chances of that person staying more in about 2 or 3 months is probably pretty minimal. So what you want to do, job specification, minimum qualifications, nothing more. So recruiting is all the things that you do to get the right number of people, or a minimum number of people, or the actual number of people that you want to apply for a job, who are qualified to apply when you want them to apply, or at the time that you need them to apply. We can do this both internally and externally. Although if you do it internally, you're only usually talking about one job and not more than one job. Sometimes it could be two, but probably not. These are the type of websites that small businesses use to recruit because they may not have the resources for other people. May not have the resources to go out and do that. Notice here about small businesses. They have to recruit and retrain and retain skilled people. So usually they don't have, and unfortunately, they usually don't have the skills, the resources to be able to do that. They just simply can't compete. So they need to be innovative and do things like mentioned down here. help get the staff to help do the recruiting. Now, this is recruiting from external resources, and I'm sure that you don't see this slide too well. So it's best if you look at the figure 11.4 on page 308. This talks about external resources, talks about internal resources, and then selection, hiring, and then orientation. Selection actually, selection actually starts with the recruiting process. And in the recruiting process, what you're trying to do is get people people who are qualified to send in a resume or an application or both. And then the selection begins, because let's assume that everybody who submits a resume or an application or both is qualified. And so there has to be some kind of screening process that goes through. So that's the first step. The first step in selection is getting the resumes in. The second step is a screening process, and then there's additional screening processes that go on after that. So we've gathered information. We decide based upon that information who can go through the next steps in a hiring process. That's usually talking to the hiring manager, maybe completing a test if required, etc. Obviously, all the legal parameters have to be followed. So here's some of the steps in the selection process. We talked about it a little bit before, getting the completed applications in. Initial interview and follow-up. Initial usually is a screening interview conducted on the phone. Person passes that, he or she goes to the next, which is normally with the hiring manager. Employment tests if they're required. Background investigations. Having an employee take a physical. Most larger organizations require this today. And then having a trial or a probationary work period. I would tell you that there's problems with that. Stay away from that if at all possible, because you have to be very accurate in what you're doing. Now, there are some, especially like union, they do have those trial periods, and they have to be there. But if not necessary, stay away from it because it can cause problems. And if you don't know, ask for legal assistance, legal advice somehow, so you're not doing something you don't want to do. Again, watch things like posting on Facebook. Employers are known to check those things, so you want to make sure that that's where you want it to be. Again, this is problematic. A lot of people don't like that. Some of you may not like what I just had to say. All I'm trying to say is, if you're looking for a job, make sure you look at your Facebook posts and things of that nature, because something that is derogatory, not meant to be, can work against you. We can also hire contingent workers. These are people who are part-time, temporary workers, seasonal workers, etc. Notice that the majority are under 25. Well, contingent workers have come with a lot of pluses. They can help when you don't have all your full-time staff around. You can bring them in for peak times. You can have them because the economy doesn't support full-time employment. You will save on benefits because you don't have to pay certain things. And it is a way to find future employees. you can use staffing agencies, etc., and they'll do a lot of the work for you. Now we're going to talk here about once we've gotten got employees in, we have to both train them and develop them. The first part of training and development comes in orientation. And I think we're going to talk about orientation later. And if we do, okay. And if we don't, that's okay too. You have to make sure you're getting the person oriented properly. Yes, there's forms to fill out, etc. But the second part of orientation is getting the new person to his or her job site and getting them in with the people he or she's going to work with on a daily basis. So training is showing somebody how to do something. Focusing on attaining short-term skills, whereas development is long-term because you're working on with somebody to develop them to be a better employee. So in doing this, we have to do what's known as a needs assessment. Assessing organization needs, that's known as a needs assessment. And employee skills and needs, and develop the appropriate training programs. And then design the programs to meet those deficiencies or help people over those deficiencies. And then you have to evaluate whether or not what you did is the right thing. So here are the different types of training programs. We have orientation, as I mentioned. On-the-job training, exactly what it says. You're showing somebody how to do the job physically on the job, pairing that person with a seasoned employee. On-the-job training is very good, but you have to be prepared that you could have a lot of what's known as scrap. So you're showing somebody how to do something, well, that doesn't work, throw that one away, let's use another one. Apprenticeships, off-the-job training, online training, vestibule training, and job simulation. Management development is a little bit different. Remember here we're developing for the long term. So we're doing things here about on coaching, or maybe mentoring, understudy positions, job rotation, which we talked about in chapter 10. And then, of course, we can do off-the-job courses and training as well. These types of things are usually set up for people at the higher levels of employment, middle managers and above. We can use networks. A lot of people like those. That establishes relationships with key managers. Mentoring is another thing I mentioned that here a skilled individual helps the new person negotiate the barriers and the ins and outs of the corporation. Now this is a bugaboo. It's something that has to be done, but most people don't like to do it. And that is appraising performance. Has to be done in many cases, although there is an initiative to get away from it. Until that comes along, it's something that people normally do, organizations do. So what a person is being evaluated on is his or her job performance against published standards. Nothing more and nothing less. If it's not taking those things into consideration, then it's not a good evaluation. Now, yes, there are some things about how well a person does things, whether he's friendly and punctual and things of that, or she is punctual and things of that nature. Those other things come in, a good corporate citizen, etc. But performance is judged against published standards. I'm not going to get into 360 because we're talking about there's a lot of different ways to do evaluations and just talking about 360, then we're going to leave some other ones out. So I talked about it. We already had the standards. Everybody knows what they are, and they're measurable. That's the communication part. Again, evaluating against the standards. Discuss results with employees based upon the standard, not the employee. You don't like the way he or she parts their hair. It has nothing to do with performance. Take action as required, and then use the results to make appropriate decisions. This gives you the do's and don'ts of performance appraisals. And what you want to do is you want to focus on performance, and you don't focus on anything else. An employee has to be brought into the process. You're talking with them one-on-one. Should be a private conference, by the way. And you start out by stressing what the employee did well, and then talking about what the employee doesn't do well and what he or she needs to do to improve, and help them set up a plan for improvement. No personal attacks. It's only work related. And don't put the employee on the hot seat. And what I want to say here is, and this is very important, no employee should ever be surprised when it comes to his or her annual performance evaluation. There should have been some counseling, there should have been some coaching, there should have been some letters saying performance has to improve, etc., some verbal warnings along the way. So here's you identify what needs to be done. We talked about, well, let's pass this along. These are the major uses of performance appraisals, but I think we've talked about them enough that we don't have to discuss them again. Yes, they are used as a basis for possible termination, but as I said before, employees should know what his or her performance is going to be before we get there. These are some problems that we find. We have a contrast effect. That's you're comparing one employee to another when that may not be the right comparison or shouldn't even be compared. Remember, you're going against performance. Now, there are some performance evaluation tools that require a comparison. So this may or may not be anything. Now, the comparison there is not you're comparing him against her, but if you're given a choice between Sally and Jim, and you choose one or the other, that's the comparison. You're not doing it, I chose Sally over you when you're talking to Jim. Halo effect is allowing performances in certain areas to unfairly influence the entire evaluation. And then similar to me says, well, hey, that guy or gal performs like I do, so I'm going to give him a higher score. Compensation programs. We do compensation programs to attract employees. Now, there are normally three ways that you can set compensation. You can lag the market, you can meet the market, you can exceed the market. But you want to have a compensation program that builds employee incentive to work, keep valued employees from going away someplace else, help them with giving them what we would call financial security. And we have compensation, salary, hourly wage or day work, and piecework system. I don't think we need to explain those. I think those are fairly self-explanatory. These are types of pay plans, compensation, commission, bonus plans, and then profit sharing plans. Profit sharing plans are usually rolled into with something else. We know that there's fringe benefits, paid time off, sick time, other type things, health care, dental care, etc. And we also know that other benefits are becoming more and more. These are a range of benefits. I'm not going to go over them. I just put this up for you to look at. We know about company cars and things of that nature. Cafeteria style benefits allow an employee to select benefits they want up to a certain dollar amount. And here's some soft benefits that they include, which you can look at. Managers have to know and leaders have to know the laws and the needs of businesses in each country in which they operate. So compensation has to be converted to what the foreign currency is. You are mandated in some cases to give certain kinds of healthcare benefits and vacation benefits and things of that nature. So those laws, again, are things that have to be known. Flexible scheduling is allowing workers to choose to work at a certain time period within a core operating hour. So in other words, the core operating hours would be, let's say, from 10 to 2. So an employee has to be on the job from 10 to 2, and he or she can schedule the remainder of the work day to fit his or her needs. Compressed work weeks are exactly what they say. 4-day work weeks of 10-hour days. There are 3-day work weeks of 12-hour days. There are some pluses and minuses to those. One, of course, is more time off. A downside or a minus is we know that on-the-job injuries occur after the normal 8 hours at work. That's compressed. We talked about that. Based at home work, I think we've talked a little bit about this at home before. It's not for everybody. People that do this have to be committed to doing this type of work. Job sharing benefits, we know what those are. Person is sharing a job with one or more people. You can get people into the workforce that haven't been in the workforce. We know that it does motivate people, but of course you're not getting full-time employment, so you're not getting benefits. We have to understand that employees are going to move on. Some are reassigned, some resign, and some are not continued. So we have to prepare for those types of things. If we terminate employees, which has happened quite frequently during especially during the Great Recession, we have to be careful about how we do that. We have to have exit interviews and things of that nature. So it's something that is important and something that we need to do. Well, we're at the end, and I'm going to take a short break and come back at 5:57. But I want to take this time to give you the lecture discussion question in case I get cut off. I hope I don't, but in case I do get cut off. And that is, the text says that the job enrichment concept is based on Hertzberg's motivating factors. What similarities do you see between Hertzberg's motivating factors and the job enrichment and job enrichment? What and why? What dissimilarities do you see between Hertzberg's motivating factors and job enrichment, and why? Again, the lecture discussion question for this week is the job enrichment is based upon the Hertzberg's motivating factors. What similarities do you see between Hertzberg's motivating factors and job enrichment, and why? and what dissimilarities do you see between Hertzberg's motivating factors and why? By the way, if dissimilarities, if any. Okay, and we will be back with chapter 12 just a few seconds. All right, chapter 12, dealing with union and employee management issues. The objectives here are to give a brief history of organized labor in the United States, discuss major legislation affecting labor unions, outline the objectives of labor unions, describe the tactics used by both labor and management during conflicts, and look at the role of unions in the future. And then we're going to look at some of today's controversial employment management issues, such as executive compensation, pay equity, child care, elder care, drug testing, and violence in the workplace. Organized labor. Unions are employee organizations whose main objective is to represent their employees, their members, in employee management negotiations of job-related issues. Those could be pay, it could be any number of things. Notice what unions were responsible for. We tend to denigrate unions today, or a lot of us do, not everybody, and we find that they're responsible for the minimum wage, overtime rules, workers' compensation, severance pay, child labor laws, etc. And some benefits that we take for granted today, like vacations, health care. We didn't have those before World War II. And unions went to their employers and said, hey, we're doing all this work for the war effort, and we're not complaining, but we think we ought to be given some benefits just besides our pay. Public sector unions do the same thing. The difference is those are government employees working usually for government agencies, teachers, firefighters, police, etc. Many states have reduced what public employee unions can do and put great onuses on them. One of the reasons that was done was to balance the books. Now, I have never been a union member, and I probably never will be. But balancing the books on the backs of employees, regardless of whether they're state employees or some other employee, is not a good tactic. And the reason it's not a good tactic is the employee, him or herself, or the employees as a group, had little to do with the company getting in the situation in which they were. They didn't make a strategic plan. They didn't do product development, a number of other type things. So we have to be careful about when we denigrate employee unions and specifically public employee unions. Yes, I understand they're paid by us, the taxpayer, but then I think we have to look at what's the downside. What do unions want? They want to work with a fair and competent management organization. Look at the second one. They want to be treated like everybody else wants to be treated. What's wrong with that? Nothing. And they want to receive their fair share of the wealth that they happen to help create. Again, I don't think there's anything that we should say is un-American in that stance. The history of unions in the United States is quite varied. The first came a craft union in 1792 in Philadelphia, the cordwainers. By the way, if that's an unusual word for you, it is for most people. They were shoemakers. Notice what the work weeks were, 60 hours plus. Now, if we're talking about a 5-day work week, that's 12 hours a day. If we're talking about a 6-hour work week, or 6-day work week, which it probably was, that's a 10-hour work day. The prevailing wages were not good, and there was a lot of child labor. Now, what's that have to do with anything? Well, think of what we have today when we complain about outsourcing. Now, I'm not saying we shouldn't complain about outsourcing, but you had child labor, they're going to work cheaper than the regular laborers. So that was a complaint. We have to remember that. We don't have child labor in the United States as we used to. This is one of the things that really helped unions take off in the United States. This terrible blaze at the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory in New York. Many women, 146, were trapped, couldn't get out, and that's something that they say, labor unions say we're critical in maintaining safety regulations. And actually, if we didn't have unions, we wouldn't have the Occupational Health and Safety Administration. A lot of people complain about them, but safety in the workplace, I mean, why wouldn't you want it? What we had here is the first organized union, if you will. First organized national union was the Knights of Labor, formed in 1869. Had about 700,000 people as members, and then faced a calamity during a strike in Chicago in the early 1980s. And there was a lot of ballyhooing back and forth between the police on one side and union on the other. Somebody threw a Molotov cocktail. 8 police officers were killed during the explosion and subsequent fire. And the union was held to be responsible for that, although no union member was ever actually convicted. But they were felt to be behind this. And so that caused the Knights of Labor to go out of business. Not too long after that, we had the rise of the American Federation of Labor, or AFL, which was founded by Samuel Gompers in 1886. Then we had, and by the way, the AFL were skilled workers and craft people. Then we have the industrial unions, unskilled and semi-skilled workers such as coal miners, automotive, the United Auto Workers, Teamsters unions, and things of that nature. The CIO decided, the Congress of Industrial Organizations decided to break away from the AFL in 1935 and had their own union. And then the two got back together again in 1955. And AFL today, AFL-CIO, has about 56 unions or affiliations with them and about 12.5 million members. Public unions, I'm not going to go over this too much. There's about 14.5 million public union members. And remember that, as we said before, their wages are paid by taxpayers like you and me. Labor unions struggled. There were actually laws on the books that banned labor unions. They banned picketing. They banned collective bargaining. They banned soliciting for people to join unions. There were many employers that had contracts that were known as yellow dog contracts that an employee had to sign, meaning that he would not join a union or she would not join a union. And then where we came to eventually become is through this collective bargaining. And that was promoted by a number of laws that were passed in the United States. And we'll get to those in a few minutes. Collective bargaining is a key issue. And it's a key issue no matter whether it's a private union through AFL-CIO or a union with public sector employees. Forming a union, by the way, you can see the laws that came into being to help unions and people to become unionized on figure 12.1 on page 338 at the top. Norris-LaGuardia Act 1932, the National Labor Relations Act, or the Wagner Act 1935, Fair Labor Standards Act, and then of course we had the Taft-Hartley Law in 1947, and then finally the Labor Management Reporting Act, the Griffin-Landrum Law in 1959. So if you want to form a union, the National Labor Relations Board will, the National Labor Relations Board was created to oversee labor management issues and to provide guidelines. Certification, that's the process for which a union is recognized by the National Labor Relations Board as a bargaining agent for a group of employees. Decertification is just the reverse of that. And the National Labor Relations Board will come in and oversee the election to either have a union or to decertify a union. Well, now why do you want to have a union? People join unions because there's poor relationships between management and the workers. The organization climate is not good. The work conditions are poor, and we're talking about the working environment here. And the union has a good reputation. And by the way, many of them do have good reputations. Some, of course, don't. We know that. A National Labor Management Agreement, the contract, this sets the terms. Usually the contracts are 3 or 4 years long, and this says how union's going to operate. It says how management's going to operate. And we have the security clause, which stipulates workers who reap union benefits must either join a union or pay union dues. Now, there was a court case that got to the Supreme Court, or was a case that got to the Supreme Court earlier this year. And a worker in California was objecting to paying union dues. The Supreme Court tied 4-4. As you know, there's only eight justices on the Supreme Court at the current time. And because of that, the lower court ruling stood in favor of the union. We can expect that case will come back to the Supreme Court once the court gets back to 9 members, regardless of who wins this election. I suspect that will come back. But we have to look at something here, and it's a question of fairness. And if I'm a union member, or if I'm not a union member, but I'm getting all the benefits of the union, shouldn't I have to somehow either pay dues or join the union, one of the two? Aren't we kind of against in this country the free rider? Now, I'm not extolling unions, and I'm not extolling people who don't like unions. Now, what I'm saying is this, to me, is a question of fairness. It's not a question of being a union member or paying union dues. It's a question of fairness. You reap the benefits, you ought to have to pay something to make sure that you're getting those. These are union security agreements. A closed shop means that somebody has to be a union member before he or she is hired. A union agreement, on the other hand, the shop agreement, workers have to be members of a union to be hired. Don't have to be, excuse me, but have to agree to join the union within a specified time period after being hired. And then the agency shop allows employers to hire non-union workers who don't have to join the union but must pay fees. That goes back to the court case we were talking about. Now, here's some more here at a closed shop. That is no longer legal. The union shop we're talking about here still around. Agency shop still is, and the open shop, again, which we also talked about. Right to work laws, it simply says anybody who wants to work has a right to work. They don't have to be a union member. I've always been confused about this because I didn't think there was any laws in the books that precluded people from working. Now, this is here. Notice what the legislation says: workers the right under an open shop to join or not join a union. Well, okay. But right to work, the way it's really conferred to in the United States today, and by the way, there's a map that shows you states that have right to work laws, really kind of boils down to being anti-union. It's not necessarily protecting the workers at all. It's just being anti-union. Taft-Hartley law granted states the power to outlaw union shop agreements, which we talked about that. Agreement and I'm reading these because they're important for us to remember, because I don't want to gloss over this. Agreement in the right to work states it gives workers the right to join or not join a union if one exists in our workplace. Pretty much what I've said, but as I mentioned, really the way right to work is promoted in the United States is actually anti-union. It's not so much pro-worker as it is anti-union. Okay, resolving disagreements. Well, if a union worker has a disagreement and he or she files a grievance that management isn't abiding by some type of clause in the union management contract, and that person takes it to his or her shop steward, who is the first line in this. And this person works in the organization and represents the union employee interests on a daily basis. Bargaining zone is what we know is the range of options between what's the initial offer and the final acceptance. Mediation and arbitration. Two different tactics that are used by employers, management, and the unions. Mediation is actually bringing in a third party, and there are federal mediators who come in, and their primary purpose is to encourage both sides to keep talking and to keep negotiating and to keep working on the contract and to try to keep things from getting out of hand and being acrimonious. An arbitrator, on the other hand, is a person who comes in and has the authority to set the contract. It's a binding agreement. Now, both sides have agreed to this, and they bring in an arbitrator. Both sides have agreed, and they know that the arbitrator has the authority to set what's going to be final. We find this in baseball. Baseball has an arbitration situation. The problem with arbitration is there are winners and losers. And I'm not suggesting that we should do away with arbitration, but everybody has to understand that there are winners and losers. There's nobody that And somebody's going to come out ahead, somebody's going to come out behind. This is the grievance procedure, and you can see this graphically displayed at 12.6 and figure 12.6 in your in the text on page 342. Notice it goes on the left side, the union, shop steward, then it's the local business manager, grievance committee, the national union officer. On the other side, a supervisor, labor relations manager, plant manager, etc. These are the tactics that unions will use when they have issues with management. And includes strikes, that means a walkout. And a boycott. That means they'll do something to boycott the products and try to get other people to boycott the products made by this particular company. We'll have a work slowdown. Sometimes that's known as work to the rule. Whatever the rule is, that's how far a person is going to work, and he or she will not work any further. And then, of course, we have the pickets, which are associated with the strikes. And this is what the strikes attempt to do. The strikers don't go to work. And there are two kinds of boycotts, a primary boycott and a secondary boycott. The primary, here the union encourages its members and the general public not to buy the product of the company that is being struck. A secondary boycott is an attempt by the labor union to convince others to stop doing business with that firm that is subject to the primary boycott. So one is not to buy the product, and the other one is not only not to buy the product, but to stop doing business. On the other hand, management will use lockouts. They will seek a court injunction, getting people to come back to work, or they will hire strike breakers. You don't see too many injunctions anymore, and they normally are only associated with companies that have federal contracts and are considered in the national priority. It would be like the steel industry used to be years ago, and some other ones. This just talks about what we just said, what a lockout does, what an injunction does, what strike breakers do. And so that's it. Unions are facing a lot of issues today. We all know that. Union membership is falling. People don't see the need for unions. And of course, many unions have given back to their employees to maintain, to their employers to maintain jobs. We will probably see unions go after more white-collar workers, and unions will probably try to take on asking for more job security, profit sharing, things of that nature, simply because companies continue to move jobs off overseas. As a matter of fact, you might have just heard that Ford Motor Company is closing a small, one of its small car manufacturing plants, I think in Michigan. Don't hold me to that, and moving it to Mexico. This is a graphic display of union membership by state, and we're not going to discuss that. Here are some contentious issues we're going to talk about. Executive compensation. And executive compensation is set by the board of directors. But a lot of rank and file stockholders don't like that. They think that they're overpaid. And they get things like stock options and all sorts of things like that. When they get a stock option, they can buy the stock at the price that's already been set. Well, I'm sorry that we are finished.